This is week 2 with questions about interest political parties, and political participation. The first question is why people don't participate beyond the act of voting. Why is it that so few people really participate in politics? If you think about it, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. Join an interest group, write letters to members of Congress and or to your state legislature, go visit your local city hall whenever they're doing sessions that are open to the public. There's all kinds of ways of political participation. And if you look in the book, I think you'll see a list of some of the things that people do. So why is it that people occasionally vote and that's about it, and they don't do anything else? The kinds of people that participate, that engage in political participation, usually have leisure time and energy. That means generally they're college-educated people in the upper classes of society, where they have a flexible work schedule. I grew up in a blue-collar home, and one thing I can tell you in those days, and it probably still exists the same way today, and that is that there's very little energy after you get home from work. And so you have no desire to do much more than just kind of collapse in front of the TV and watch some mindless television. And you don't have a whole lot of leisure time either. And that's become more of a problem even for white-collar workers as well as blue-collar workers in American society today, because it just people are working harder than ever. I've seen studies that show that large numbers of people, I forget what the exact percentage was, eat lunch at their desk. So they don't even take the hour for lunch. So the fact that people don't have leisure time, nearly as much leisure time as they once did, and they're exhausted when they get home, that means that things like politics are generally avoided. Um, they only want to do what is pleasurable, and that can't be pleasurable when it takes a lot of effort on your part. The second thing is alienation. We seem to see a lot more political alienation than we ever did before. People, mainly because, I would say mainly because the society is much more critical of leadership than it used to be. And it's not just political leadership, it's all leadership. Whether you're talking about faith in your doctor, or faith in your church, or faith in your president. The fact is that people don't think that way anymore, and as they once did, largely because of scandals. It probably began with President Nixon and the Watergate, where people realized that the president isn't this guy we were told about in grade school. So over time, people have less and less faith in all the institutions surrounding them. I remember when when I was a kid, doctors used to make visits to your house, and it was just routine. He had his black bag and he'd come to the house if somebody was sick. And we all saw him as a healer. So if he said, you're going to be okay, you just had the flu or something, you immediately began to heal. And the body began to heal itself because we had faith, you know. We just had faith in the doctor, even though we had no idea of where he went to medical school or any of that kind of stuff. But today is a different world. There's criticism of everything and everybody, and that leads to alienation, a feeling that these people, whoever they are in authority, don't represent me. Another characteristic of modern society, the 21st century, is apathy. We just don't have the kind of idea that we have a responsibility for civic duty. There's a sense my responsibility is to myself and to my immediate family, and that's it. And so people who are apathetic generally avoid politics. Um, Leading up to is the next one, distrust of politicians and politics. There's a tremendous amount of distrust. We don't trust anybody. I think one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost the presidency was because people don't trust her. They didn't trust him, her husband, and they don't trust her. And no matter what she said, even though she said all the right things, it didn't really work to get her to be elected president because of the high levels of distrust. People don't like any of the candidates in a given election. Part of that is due to the fact that people are alienated and distrustful, but it's also partially due to the fact that there's so much negative campaigning that goes on. People, the candidates, will say to themselves or see the polls, and the polls will show that the public doesn't really like them very much. I mean, all you got to do is look at the say presidential popularity polls. You know, do you think the president? The question asked is, do you think the president is doing a good job? And if you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, presidents were generally regarded as doing a good job. They were in the 70 percentiles all the time. And now, if you look at the president, and it's not just Trump, but presidents in the past 20 years, the tendency is for the ratings not to get much higher than in the 50s and oftentimes just in the 40s. So people don't like the candidates, and when they realize that people don't like either candidate, then they start negative campaigning. And when they do this negative campaigning, basically what they're saying is, I know you don't like me, but the other guy's even a bigger sleazeball than I am. And so that leads to more and more negativity on the part of the public. If the candidates were nice to each other, if they treated each other with dignity, it would be a different story. And you know, you don't have to go very far reading the news or watching television news or any of that to know that candidates are awful to each other. They're just awful. The last thing is they see social action as more profitable than political activity. People would, in other words, people would rather do something else if they're going to contribute their time. Like, for example, people will volunteer at an animal shelter or volunteer at the hospital or something like that, and see that as more beneficial to themselves and to society than any kind of political activity, especially joining up and working for a political party or a candidate. Number three, how do we increase the numbers of people at the polls? Well, we can make it easier for people to vote. We can have weekend voting. One of the criticisms of voting on a Tuesday is that a lot of people are at work or have to make a real sacrifice to show up at an election, especially if there's a line, showing up either before work or after work. You know, many people are exhausted, but they wait in line and all of that kind of thing. So that takes a real sacrifice. But if we did what the Europeans do, that is have weekend voting, devote a whole weekend to it. People are off on the weekend and they can go at their leisure. So that would be one kind of thing you could do. Another thing would be to change the registration laws. One of the things that happens to people is oftentimes they get interested in voting right before the election. And by that time, because of the way registration laws are set up, it's too late. You can't register like a couple of weeks before. So we should have registration all the way up until the election day. Online voting is another thing. I used to talk about this in class when I was teaching in the classroom all the time. I thought online voting made a whole lot of sense if we really are interested in getting people to the polls. Um, we do, the criticism against it is, oh, it's going to be corrupt and they're going to steal the elections and all that kind of stuff. Well, they do that now. And if it seems to me that the most important thing in America is money. And if we can do online banking, we should be able to design a system that's secure enough so that we could do online voting. Um, Another thing is we need better candidates. One of the things that struck me many, many years ago, probably about 40 years ago, is that the Democrats and the Republicans have run out of ideas. They don't know what to do. And there's all these problems in our society. You can list them as well as I can. And yet we don't really see very many candidates often who stand up and say, I got a real good solution to this. It seems to me like that's the reason people should be running, not running because they want the job or they like the salary or they like the prestige. No, it should be because they really have answers. And I think that's a problem. We need to find better candidates who really do have answers. They might not work, but at least we could try them. We need to change the party system. We need to allow third parties in. Right now, it's the Democrats and the Republicans, and they seem to be on this treadmill type situation where they're not going anywhere. So we need to allow opportunities for third parties to participate so that people could have some choice. Right now, and we'll talk more about this later, but right now one of the biggest problems is that the Democrats and Republicans take money essentially from the same people. And so they don't offer alternatives, not really. They don't offer real alternatives. We can maybe talk about that later. The last one is address the issues. Stop dealing in personalities and start addressing the real issues. Everybody says they want to do that, and nobody does. So if we were to do some of these things, any of these things, you can increase the numbers of people that actually show up. I think one of the main reasons, this is just personal opinion, but I think one of the main reasons why it doesn't happen, why we don't have, say, weekend voting or online voting, is because the people who are in power got elected by the people who voted. And they don't want to see the electorate enlarged because they're afraid that they'll get kicked out. In this slide, I wanted to talk about the characteristics of interest groups. What are they like in the political system? And I listed some characteristics right here, and we'll go through them. They have no formal governmental status. They're informal. Interest groups are informal. There's a set of, you could say that like when agencies and departments act as interest groups, that they're formal. But when we generally think of interest groups, we think of groups that are not part of the government. They're not even recognized by the government as such in the normal sense of law and legality. The second thing is they're usually small in number and compared to the general voting public. In other words, if you took the National Rifle Association, they represent about 2% of the American public that are part of that are gun owners. And even among the 2% that are gun owners, probably half of them or less belong to the National Rifle Association. So when you think about it, interest groups, maybe you're talking about the National Rifle Association or the ACLU or the NOW or whatever it is, they tend not to represent very large numbers of people. In the main, it's a small number of people. That is, when we compare it to the general public. In other words, like the vast majority of people don't belong to any interest group. They're united by a common characteristic, such as they're all share something in common, like they're all lawyers or farmers or concerned about an issue like abortion. So they come together because of an issue or because of their economic interest, which is usually economic in nature, like they're lawyers or doctors or business people, realtors or um, some kind of other business, where essentially what happens is they feel threatened by the government and they come together, form a group, and then try to get the government not to regulate them or to reduce in essence, to reduce the amount of money that they're making. Um, the next one is they tend to represent economic interest groups more than any other. So if you look at the list of groups at, say, the state and local level, you'd see that most of the groups are economic in nature. One of the biggest groups you have at the state level that you wouldn't have anyplace else would be teachers' unions. And why are teachers' unions so powerful? They're there because the government pays their salary. And so so they're going to be very active. Another type of group that tends to be very active would be any other ones that are dealing with their economic livelihood, like lawyers and doctors and people like that who have to get licensed. So they want to make sure that the licensing process is fair to them, and they also want to make sure that the licensing process reduces the number of people in the group so that it isn't real easy to get a license and therefore flooding the economic marketplace. Like if you look at some of the blue collar worker types that have been in some way regulated, like barbers and bartenders and people like that, it's pretty easy to get those kinds of licenses, and therefore the numbers of people involved flood the market. And then the last one would be that successful groups are usually elite groups, that is, those with the following characteristics. When I talk about elite, I mean they have prestige, they have money, and they have organizational leadership. Those are the three key characteristics of elite groups. Prestige is very important because what that means is they're respected by the public. So, for example, when doctors talk about socialized medicine or some, now we call it national health insurance, or Bernie Sanders calls it, as I read in a paper today, he calls it Medicare for all. And when the doctors say that they're opposed to that kind of thing, the public, they have prestige with the public, and therefore the public doesn't think, oh, they're doing this because they're trying to protect their money, their livelihood in terms of how much they're making, whether or not they're going to be able to afford a Mercedes next year. No, they don't think like that. They think doctors are saying that because they care about my well-being, and they want to make sure that I'm getting good medical care. That's what prestige is. So in other words, when they come out and talk to you, whoever the group representatives are, if they come out and talk to you, the extent to which people are willing to believe them is the source of that prestige. The second thing they have to have is money. And there's no such a thing as being able to operate in the American political system without a lot of money. Most groups are prohibited from being very active because they don't have money. A classic example would be animal rights. Animal rights groups could be out there screaming that most people should be vegan, that it affects climate change, that it affects the future of food, and you can go on with all kinds of use of water, and you just can go on forever about all of this. But they can't afford to go on television and say those things. So they're kept out of it. And the big interest, like agriculture, big ag, is spending the money to pretend that they've got small farms when they've got these mega farms that are destroying the environment, factory farms as we call them. So anyway, money is a key element. And then the last one is organizational leadership. That's the ability to take whatever resources you have as an organization and put them to good use. If you don't do that, or if you're unable to do that, then you're just wasting your time and money, even if you've got a lot of money. The other part of question one is, what role does political parties play in the system? And I've listed here 4 things. They help to simplify choice. That is to say, if you didn't have parties, or if you had multiple parties, it's possible that you could have a whole bunch of candidates at one time. Now you see that kind of thing in a primary, where there's a number of candidates, like for example, when you see presidential debates, you may see as many as 10 or 12 candidates on the stage at one time. But the role of the party is to limit or to make sure that only one person, and in the end, represents the party before the election. So during the nomination, yes, you have a whole bunch of people, but it comes down to one Democrat and one Republican when the nomination is completed. So that's what I mean by simplifying choice. You could have a whole bunch of candidates, and then the voter would be somewhat confused as to who to vote for because they wouldn't know who all the candidates are. And with only 2 parties, you only have 2 candidates. So that's what's meant by simplified choice. Another thing is they help to unite the electorate. That is, America is a very diversified country, a lot of different opinions and so on. And it's argued that the electorate is made up, when you look at either the Democrats or Republicans, of a lot of people with differing points of view. Now that's becoming less and less the case these days, where especially I would say in the Republican Party, where the conservatives and the Tea Party and all that crowd has dominated the party, so that you don't have what you used to have back in the day, which would have been like the liberal Republicans. For example, the people who were back in the 1960s representing the Republican side of the liberal politics, people like Rockefeller and people of that nature in New York, were very liberal. And you don't see that anymore. Parties tend to be more homogeneous. So uniting the electorate isn't as useful as it once was as a role. They present issue positions, and there is something to that the Democrats and Republicans take different positions on the issues. You can see that throughout, if you pay close attention to any election, that there are some differences between the parties. A lot of people complain that there's not enough, and that on many issues they seem to be the same, but in fact there is some differences, like basically it's the conservative position versus the liberal position. And then the last thing is said about the government, and this is pretty important, and it also is viable, and that is that they unify the government. So if you look at the governmental structure, whether you're looking at state government or local government or national government, it's diversified. Power is divided up into executive, legislative, and judicial branches. You can even add bureaucracy in there. We'll talk more about that later. But in essence, when you have parties, the parties unite those branches if and when the party has a majority in the executive, legislature, and even in the judicial branch. They unite the government, so the government speaks more of one voice rather than Democrats and Republicans fighting each other. So if the legislature is made up of a majority of Republicans, the governor's Republican, then they tend to have a basic agreement with each other, and in that way unify the government.